Hey guys, welcome back. So now hopping back into more talk on Doomsday Clock. In doing so with this playlist covering a number of the events that have happened throughout the series with the addition of tie-ins and lead-ups to hopefully make it a lot easier, because I feel like a lot of you guys are kind of split down the middle. Like half of you know what's going on and the rest kind of got the gist of it, but you're like, what is this? And so I'm gonna do my best to kind of simplify some of this throughout the course of these videos. So if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so picking up from my last talk about Dr. Manhattan and really digging into the mind of Dr. Manhattan throughout the span of Watchmen comics, starting from his origin and leading all the way up to his disappearance at the conclusion of Watchmen, which had then led us to our talks on the later released Prelude, where we had finally discovered where Dr. Manhattan went after leaving Ozymandias. And what we had found out is that he went exactly where he said he was going to go, which was a galaxy that was less complicated, and it was here that he acted upon his curiosity of creating this new universe. And so really it's from this point where things begin to bleed over into the DC universe. And at the launch of DC Rebirth, when we received the artwork by Gary Frank and Brad Anderson, this image set the tone pretty much for everything that was to come in DC Rebirth, and doing so by modeling heavily after Michelangelo's painting called The Creation of Adam, with the hand of God reaching out to the hand of man, which I do not think is a coincidence. But it's from here that we start to see a number of events which have taken place, which are clearly the works of Dr. Manhattan in the DC universe, where he has stepped in a number of times, and in the beginning much of it was covert, but as time moved on and a number of events had taken place that weren't too much to his liking, we found that there were a few more instances where he had to be more overt than covert. And we find out through the course of time that much of this also has to do with the full purpose of the Doomsday Clock, which pretty much in a nutshell is that point in the future where Dr. Manhattan cannot see past, and the last thing that he does see is Superman. And this is the reason why Superman is deemed as that 12th hour for the final countdown, because it is after that point where Dr. Manhattan sees time no more, nor the universe or anything for that matter. Hence no more dials on the clock after Superman. And so now the first biggest red flag that we got was once again DC Rebirth #1, when Batman had found the comedian's button in the Batcave, which then of course led us into the button event. And with this happening, this was like our first look, or even clue if you will, about Dr. Manhattan and the Watchmen having any connection to the DC universe. And so at the time that this had came out, my channel was like brand new. And although at the time I read the button, and I've read it again recently, like it's just one of those stories that you can read again and again because it is seriously just that good. But at the time that this came out, I was mainly doing Ultimates comics and pretty much everything Marvel at the time, and it took me a while to really start doing DC videos, even though I had been easing my way back into DC from the New 52. But either way, one of the main things that I want to highlight and just go back and just bring back to the surface from the button, well actually it's more than one thing, and one of those main things is the Flashpoint timeline, which is the alternate timeline which Barry Allen created when he tried to go back and save his mother. And this is one of those things I feel like people get confused with sometimes, because Flashpoint was not an alternate universe, but it was an alternate timeline. And that's one of the things you'll see that Marvel and DC do different. Like in Marvel, if somebody travels back in time, they change things. From that point forward, you have an alternate universe. It gets its own universe designation number, and from there becomes a new reality. Versus with DC, or at least the explanation we've gotten in DC Rebirth through the explanation of Barry Allen, that when time travel is done and a speedster or whoever uses the Speed Force and changes an event, creating a new timeline, it is still the same universe, just an alternate timeline. And these alternate timelines within this same universe, they can still be accessed through Hypertime. And that's why when traveling through Hypertime, you actually see a number of different possibilities of how things may have went, all of which with the same people, all of which in the same universe, but just still different timelines. And just as a reference, I'll talk more about Hypertime on the Dark Knight's Metal playlist. I got a link for which video down in the description, so feel free to check that out for more information on Hypertime. But getting back towards the events of the button, which picked up from the conclusion of Flashpoint, which concluded with Thomas Wayne killing Eobard Thawne so that Barry Allen can go back and allow his mother to die in order to fix the timeline. But in doing so, Thomas Wayne also had given Barry Allen a letter to give to his son Bruce in hopes that all this would work and that Barry Allen would see him again. And so with all this, revisiting the button at this point in time, it's bittersweet because on one hand, I wish I had done this long ago, but on the other hand, looking back at it with everything that we know now, parts that I overlooked when I initially read it, they're just jumping out at me now having read them throughout the course of everything going on in Doomsday Clock. But going back to the beginning when Batman was examining the button of the comedian, when Batman had just tossed the button down next to the mask of Psycho Pirate, which is in Batman's possession at this point, which as a result caused Batman to see glimpses of the Flashpoint timeline, and more specifically his father Thomas Wayne, proving that Thomas Wayne still lived after the Flashpoint timeline had been presumably presumably destroyed. But where this sparks my curiosity was Psycho Pirate, whose main ability is just manipulating the emotions of others. But going back to Infinite Crisis, we found out that he was a character that played a much bigger role. And one of the things that's really intrigued me as far as more of his involvement with Doomsday Clock is his ability to regenerate, like we seen after he'd been crushed by Power Girl, to where that result was pretty different when he faced off with Black Adam. But aside from his regeneration, we've also seen Psycho Pirate disguise himself as a Legion flight ring, which is something that also resurfaced in the DC Rebirth one-shot. Around the time when Wally West had mentioned it felt like reality was telling him, don't stop fighting, you're not alone. And although throughout the course of Doomsday Clock, much of the narrative tied to this ring has pointed to an event that takes place in the future, December 27th of 3019, which caused this ring to jump back in time, and Dr. Manhattan destroys this ring just by prohibiting Alan Scott from becoming a Green Lantern in 1940, which presumably does away with the Legion of Heroes. But if a displaced version of Psycho Pirate happens to be around, especially posing as his ring, then he is definitely going to stick out like a sore thumb. And because we know by way of Tom King, who's been writing the Batman issues in DC Rebirth establishing this new run, but because we know by way of Tom King that Psycho Pirate remembers everything from pre-New 52 all the way up till now, this just opens up a slew of possibilities of his involvement later on. Not to mention early on in that series where we got Amanda Waller's comments pertaining to Psycho Pirate mentioning that he has the ability to make gods go mad, which is one of those lingering things that I wouldn't discard just yet. But getting back to the button, one of the main things I wanted to point out more so pertains to the resurrection of Eobard Thawne, the Reverse Flash, who, as I mentioned, and I'm sure many of you already know, was killed by Thomas Wayne in Flashpoint. And of course, at the time when Batman had seen Thomas Wayne, he put two and two together, contacted Barry Allen, and told him to meet with him ASAP, which for Barry Allen would be 1 minute, with him wrapping up what he was doing with one additional detour. But when this had happened and Batman immediately heard the crackle of the Speed Force, assuming it was Barry, and it was actually the Reverse Flash, like, I don't know about you guys when this first came out, but for me, this was like the most intense single minute of comic book reading I've ever seen in my life. And of course we know that that 1 minute beatdown was a bit of payback from Eobard Thawne to Thomas Wayne, which was taken out on Bruce Wayne, but man, it was brutal and classic, like one of my favorite single moments in comics, period. But when Eobard Thawne arrived in the Batcave, telling Batman about this power that he discovered, he had also mentioned that he had been resurrected, which is something I want to focus on quite heavily for just a moment, because skipping over to Doomsday Clock and doing this more so to deliver my thoughts in a more linear and chronological as possible type of way. But as far as us finding out in Doomsday Clock that at the moment when the comedian was murdered and thrown out of the building to where in that moment he was supposed to die, but much like how I mentioned Dr. Manhattan being able to see time like pearls on a necklace, he had actually removed the comedian from the Watchmen universe, bringing him into the DC universe instead of allowing him to fall to his death. And technically from the description of Dr. Manhattan, he moves the universe around himself and others when they travel with him, much like he told Ozymandias, so presumably he used the same method here. And to me it sounds like the long way around it, but I'm not going to tell Dr. Manhattan how to do what he does. But with doing so, he effectively brought the comedian into the DC universe, and not by resurrecting him from after his death, but instead snatching him up just before and placing him where he wanted him to be, which is something that we had also seen him do with Jor-El, Superman's father, at the destruction of Krypton, which we'll talk about much more in depth in the upcoming video. But in this instance, his method was the same. But in the case of Eobard Thawne, who mentions he had been dead for some time, referring to Flashpoint, and mentioning that he should still be dead for even much longer time because he shouldn't be born until like the 25th century. But when he tells Batman about this power that called out for him, that resurrected him, to which we later see him seek out in order to make it bend to his will, but upon his arrival, he of course finds out that this is a power much greater than he had anticipated. And at Eobard Thawne's arrival, talking to Dr. Manhattan and not really knowing more so who he is, but immediately recognizing him as God, and a power like nothing he has encountered, but Thawne has witnessed this power causing many changes in the timeline, but yet remaining hidden while doing so, which is why Eobard Thawne had no idea how powerful Dr. Manhattan actually was, and as a result, oh God, he got blasted Rorschach style. And this is one of those things that happened in the button that raised a question to a lot of people, like why would Manhattan bring him back and why would Manhattan take him out just like this? And my understanding of this goes much back to what I talked about in the previous video of Dr. Manhattan, who is nigh omnipotent in the DC universe, meaning power-wise he can nearly do anything, but as far as powers, he has never been omniscient. He has never been all-knowing. He's constantly trying and moving things, and because of that, in the moments that he deems deems necessary, he also makes his own corrections. And with the button showing us Eobard Thawne meeting his end the same way in two different scenarios, to where both he recognizes great power as God, to whom we know to be Dr. Manhattan, it almost appears as if Thawne's purpose in Resurrection, which soon resulted in his death, had turned out to possibly be only an experiment conducted by Dr. Manhattan to resurrect life in this universe. As a result of him not knowing everything, but knowing after his encounter with Superman where everything goes dark, there's a good chance that he wonders if he can fix it after that moment has come to pass and it's too late, which is something I'm pretty sure we'll get the answer to when they face off in Moscow, I believe, because from the looks of Dr. Manhattan's visions, this is where it's all gonna lead back to. But that'll do it for this one, guys. I really wanted to start this playlist earlier, like in February, but I got sick, then I had to move, so I was out of it for weeks. And that's the main reason why videos have just been staggering out lately. But now that we're back in full effect, we'll definitely be caught up by April for Watchmen issue 10, which is going to reveal Dr. Manhattan's biggest secrets in his connection to the DC universe. But until then, there's plenty we gotta talk about, plenty about New 52, about Superman, and many of the things that Thawne was talking about concerning Dr. Manhattan changing things throughout history, which Thawne had seen but he didn't understand. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. We got a lot of Doomsday Clock talk ahead of us. But let me know your thoughts and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.